on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to their elders past and present and thank them for their custodianship over generations of the lands on which we meet today. And for those of you joining us online, my respects, of course, to the elders of whichever country you're joining us from as well. Our guest today is Paul Tilley, very appropriately for a John Cain luncheon, as Paul tells me he worked in the Treasurer's office in the Treasury during the John Cain government here in Victoria in those heady days. Paul was an economic policy advisor to governments for more than 30 years, both state and federal, mainly in Treasury, Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, Treasurer's Office and the OECD. He is currently a visiting fellow at the ANU's Tax and Transfer Policy Institute, my favourite institute in the country, and a senior fellow at, no offence, Melbourne Law School. And prior to this excellent and weighty tome on the history of tax reform in Australia, his previous book was Changing Fortunes, A History of the Australian Treasury. This won't be a depressing chat, will it, Paul? Even though we've just been noting there's been very little by way of tax reform this century, but Paul was here to take us through what we have done well and what we may have done badly in the past. Thank you. Just attach this for the folks at home, if you don't mind.
Mm-hmm. You put it on.
Yep. Hang on that way. There you go.
Thank you. Thank you, Emma. Welcome to everyone. Thanks for having me here. Emma's done the acknowledgement of the country. I just add my respects to Indigenous people as well. I've just finished actually a week teaching over at the law school, teaching a tax policy course. As far as I know, it's the only tax policy course in Australia now. It's a sort of dwindling profession, unfortunately. I did work for. I was in the Federal Treasury, but I came down. My wife was finishing getting her articles in a law firm. I needed to get a job for 2 years, and so I did that in the Victorian Treasurer's Office with the Cain government. Rob Jolly was the Treasurer. Very difficult period of time, late 80s, early 90s, heading into that big recession. We had a pretty, but anyway, so I had that little connection. Then I went back to Canberra and did other things up in Canberra, obviously, for a long time. But so what I want to talk today about, so I wrote this book on the history of tax reform in Australia. I was really wanting to talk about sort of reform processes generally, about what is it that makes some reform processes work and others not. When you sit in government, you see some work, some don't, a lot in the middle. You know, what are the ingredients for why some are successful and some are not? That was my sort of motivation, and tax just happens to be the thing that I know most about, so that's why I chose tax. So history of tax reform. I want to sort of, when writing the book, it was difficult to know where to start. You know, where do you start a history? So I didn't want to start with colonisation of Australia. So I thought I've got to start some millennia before that. Now, this is pretty tricky, writing history of tax reform over the last 50,000 years in Australia. But so I kind of, what I'd sort of grown up in a public finance sort of world, thinking about is the tax system as being part of a social contract that a society has. So it's a form of a social contract between the government and citizens, or it's part of that social contract. We, the citizens, give you, the government, the right to tax us, but in return, especially in a democratic society, we expect various things. So this is a broad social contract, and so I sort of did very briefly trace that through Indigenous societies, and about obviously there's no tax system as such, there's no monetary economy, but there is a social contract, and it's expressed through various cultural practices. So I talked to an ANU academic about that, and sort of try to just get started there. But then I kind of skipped through colonisation and get to federation, because in a sense that's kind of where, or it's where I kind of wanted to focus the book, the sort of the federated Australia. So I do that, So we get to the Constitution in 1901. The colonies decide to federate, or that they want to federate, to form a national government. They'd previously been governed from the UK. So the Constitution sets out the governance arrangements for the new federation. The Constitution, of course, in fact, is actually just an act of the British Parliament. It was, the British Parliament had to hand over the authority. So we didn't go through a war of independence like the Americans did. The Brits agreed to do this peacefully. So we set up the federation and the Constitution. And I guess the key thing, where I want to start, is a key thing that went into the Constitution about tax is the Commonwealth was given the exclusive right to levy customs and excise duties. Whoops, I should be flicking some slides here. So the reason for this is that there was a desire they were thinking about the national economy. We'd gone from more regional, colony economies. Things were happening more at the national level. They wanted free trade in the federated Australia, around Australia. So to do that, they needed to give customs and excise duties to the Commonwealth. So the colonies, and now the states, did not charge each other customs and excise duties. And so now it turns out that had very pervasive effects. All the other taxes at the time stayed with the states: land tax, stamp duties, fledgling income taxes. Income taxes were a fairly new thing. They all with the states. Commonwealth's got customs and excise. Customs and excise is the biggest single tax. Now that's all fine for a while. 1910, the Commonwealth introduces land tax, much to the states' annoyance. This is their tax. Then come the First World War, in 1915, the Commonwealth introduces income tax, again, much to the annoyance of the states. This is the Commonwealth encroaching on what they saw as their tax base. And what it meant, of course, is we now got overlapping income taxes. We've got income tax at the Commonwealth level and the state levels. So if you're a business, especially operating across state boundaries, you've got multiple tax authorities you've got to deal with now. And it's not like we had any uniformity in how we levied income tax. Very complex and a big problem. So we go on and I'm going to sort of trace that between the two world wars, but I'll just pause. This is probably more interesting to me, a sort of tax economist, than most people, but we're used to defining an income tax rate. Okay, you've got an income tax, you've got your base and you need your rate. We're used to a stepped marginal tax rate idea. Okay, no tax on the first 18,200, then it's 19 cents out to 45,000, then it goes to 32.5, then to 37, and then to 45. You step up marginal tax rates. They didn't do that. They wanted a very pure expression of vertical equity, of progressivity in the tax system. So they're worried. They thought those steps were sort of not sufficient. So they wrote a formula into the Tax Act. Your tax rate was 3 pence plus 3/800ths of a pound, of each additional pound. So your tax rate changed with each and every pound additional income you earned. This was, they're defining an average tax rate, not a marginal tax rate. It's a really strange concept. So you get this continuously increasing. No one knew what their tax rate was. You couldn't work it out, what your tax rate was, because or you could plug this formula in and make a guess until the end of the year. Now that survived until 1950, when they decided, the rest of the world would have this stepped marginal tax rate idea. We better get on board. They did that, but they went to 28 steps. Okay, we've got 4 now, but they're really worried about, is this a sufficient expression of progressivity? Now, we kind of moved on from all this, but anyway, a little peculiarity of the early days. So we go between the two world wars with income tax at both Commonwealth and state level, very complex, increasingly complex, where you've got businesses operating, around the country. Have a couple of royal commissions, can't sort it out. And for any tax aficionados here, the 1936 Tax Act did come out of it. But we get to 1942, the Second World War. Commonwealth needs a lot more income tax, a lot more tax. And this stage now, income tax is the only one capable of this sort of revenue generation. They say to the states, look, can you just vacate income tax for the duration of the war? We'll give it back after the war. We just need it now to finance the war effort. The states say, no, you shouldn't even be in this space. And then, so the Commonwealth commissions a review, which considered the issues for 6 weeks and wrote like a 20 or 40 page report that said the Commonwealth should take over income tax. The Commonwealth did that, used its constitutional powers to force the states out of income tax. What they did, I won't go into the detail of how they do that, because the states then, and still do, have the constitutional right to levy income tax. But what the Commonwealth basically did is said, we'll give you grants equal to your income tax revenue, and we're going to legislate this additional income tax, and our income tax will take precedence over yours. So we're giving you the grant, you're not losing any revenue, but if you have to explain to your citizens about why you're imposing income tax now on top of ours when you've got all the revenue for us. So this sets up this vertical fiscal imbalance where the Commonwealth's got the big whip hand, raising most of the tax revenue and giving grants to the states. This sort of, so now about 80% of tax revenue is raised at the Commonwealth level, but about 50% of spending is done at the state level. So to get that to work out, the Commonwealth has to give grants to the states. Been a feature of the Australian Federation. Now, the theme in the book, and I'm going to come back to it, is two types of reviews that I talk about. There's foundational reviews. They're reviews that make the arguments for a policy change, even if you don't actually get immediate implementation. When determinative reviews, sorts of reviews where you just come along and do a quick fire implementation. Now, to be able to do that, you need the arguments to have been established earlier. So there's an advantage to having reviews that establish arguments and debates, even if you don't immediately get the action. So we had these earlier royal commissions that established the case for tax unification, and then this quick-fire 6-week review on the Second World War gave the government the answer it's looking for, and the government then implements that. So I want to come back to that theme. Okay, so let's just roll through a little bit more history. We now go into the post-war era in Australia, around the world obviously, a world war, and so there's this lengthy period of economic and social stability. This is kind of through the Menzies government in Australia, so-called golden years, a long period of time. We've got steady, there's little bits and pieces going on, pretty steady economic growth. There's this bit of Keynesian economic management going on, the government using the budget in a counter-cyclical way, social stability for a long period of time. There's a couple of things happening here. One is that there actually are underlying problems which are not actually that apparent in a kind of low inflation environment, underlying economic structural problems. And so they don't become apparent until a bit later. The other thing, this is a period of time when the size of government in Australia increases, and I'll come to a chart in a moment. So consider this, between 1954 and 1970, so it's a 15-year period, there's not a single change in the income tax rate scale. Okay, we're very used to now this idea every year or two or three, the government announces some tax cut. We're about to get the stage 3 tax cuts, which come on top of the stages 1 and stage 2. They went 15, 16 years, did not make a single change. Okay, so bracket creep sticking away, even in a low inflation environment, you still get a lot of bracket creep in 15 years. So what that does is to have a look at this chart. If we sort of just track this from left to right, we look at, starting in 1901, size of government's about 5% of GDP, so now it's about 30%. So very small, limited government. We don't have a social welfare system. This is just basic public goods. The first spike you see there in kind of, late teens is World War I. Okay, and then I'm tracking the green line here. This is the Commonwealth and the states added up. The red line here is the states, the blue line's the Commonwealth. First World War, you can see, okay, ramp up the tax size of government, but we revert afterwards, but not back to the pre-war level. There's a ratcheting up and only partial reversion. The second spike is the Great Depression. Same thing, we ramp up, only a partial diversion. The third spike, the big one in the early 1940s, late 30s, early 40s, is the Second World War. So size of government increases dramatically and the size of the tax burden increases dramatically. Then post World War II, we see again this reversion, but not back to the pre-war level. And then if you follow from about the mid-1950s there, what you see is that steady growth over the next 15 to 20 years. The size of government in Australia is just steadily increasing. And so this is through the golden years. And this is the thing where there's no change in the personal income tax scale for 15 years. So it's bracket creeps, adding. So there's this expanding of social welfare payments and other benefits. Initially returned soldiers, but then a broader base. So we go from whatever it is, about 20% of GDP is a tax burden, up to 25 to 30. So, and so then it levels out once you get to about the 1980s. It's been pretty flat actually. I mean, there's ups and downs there. You'll see where there's big recessions, the GFC, but we're pretty much bumped along in that 25 to 30% range for about 40 years now. Okay, and that's the story, and that's my kind of story of this sort of size of government. I'll just show one other chart. This is the tax mix at the Commonwealth level. So just the Commonwealth's total taxes, what's the mix of taxes they've got. So the blue line is customs and excise. So we see for the first 10 years, that is 100% of Commonwealth tax revenue. That's their only tax base. 910 they introduced land tax, and then 1915, the big drop in the blue line, they introduced income tax. So we look down the bottom and we can see the orange line is personal income tax, the red line is company income tax. So customs and excise is not falling in dollar terms, it's growing along. This is just because it's a percentage of the total. So as you introduce income tax, customs and excise becomes smaller. Now we track that through to the Second World War, and where we see the big ramping up in income tax, especially personal income tax, and then post-war personal income tax is the main tax, the main revenue raiser in Australia. It becomes this sort of mass revenue raiser. And it goes through, then we see through the golden years there, the increase in personal income tax. See the slope of the line through the 50s and 60s and into the 70s. The next interesting thing here though, we track from about the kind of early to mid 70s to now, so that's 50 years, that line is pretty flat. It is not kicking up. I don't buy this whole thing about the burden of personal income tax is increasing to unbearable levels. It's been about half of total Commonwealth tax revenue for 50 years, half a century. Now you see that bit of a kick down in 2000, that's the GST being introduced, so it's not really a sort of substantive change in personal income tax. But anyway, that's my kind of little history story there. I'll just move on to kind of, the more modern period. That's the sort of tracking the whole story. So what happens when we hit the late 1960s into the 1970s? We get the big inflation spike in Australia, around the world. Inflation becomes an issue around the world. So we've got a tax system and an economy that was really designed in the early decades of federation. It's really not set up for this sort of high inflation and higher tax burden world. There's big gaps in the tax base. If we look at personal income tax in particular, so we're not really taxing capital gains, we're not really taxing non-cash remuneration, fringe benefits. We don't really tax foreign sourced income. So if you're a domestic investor and you invest overseas, so big gaps. And as the tax burden increases and tax rates rise, so the top personal tax rate was as high as 90% at times. Even now it's still at 60%. So there's a big incentive to avoid tax. 60% is a lot, and there's big gaps that make it very easy to do it. And consumption tax is kind of a similar story. And the Australian economy generally is increasingly uncompetitive, especially in the Asia region. We're hiding behind these big tariff walls, so there's not competition, there's not significant competition in the Australian economy. and in relative terms, Australia's living standards are slipping. So we've got an economy, a tax system that's well and truly out of date. So what are we going to do about it? So the government, this is the McMahon government in 1972, just before the Whitlam government. Billy Snedden is Treasurer. They commission a tax review of a Commonwealth tax system and give it absolute open terms of reference. They say, we just want to have a good look at the tax system. What's wrong here? The Asprey review, Kenneth Asprey was a judge, a New South Wales Supreme Court judge. They lay out a blueprint for reform of the whole tax system. They just start from the start, they go to the end and lay out a blueprint which is consistent with reviews around the world at that time. Canada, the US, the UK were doing similar reviews, all come into similar conclusions. And the mantra was broaden the base, lower the rate. Got to get those high rates down, and the way to do it is you've got to broaden the tax base. You've got to tax capital gains, you've got to tax fringe benefits, and a whole raft of other reforms. Similar kind of story on consumption tax. Our wholesale sales tax at the time only taxed 10% of consumption. It's distortionary. We need to broaden it, consistent with what's happening in other countries. There's only 3 good tax jokes in the world that I'm aware of, and this is one of them. So Jean-Baptiste Colbert was the French finance minister, the French treasurer in the 17th century, and grappling with issues around taxation, described it as the art of plucking the goose with the least possible amount of hissing. I did tell this joke at a sort of an academic thing one time, and this crusty old academic ticked me off, and he said, you find that funny, do you? I said, I thought I do really. And he said, you might want to think about this a little more from the perspective of the goose. And actually I thought he had quite a good point. So I still think it's funny. But so when hissing, so in economic terms, what I kind of think about is, if we look at that Asprey review's 3 main criteria for assessing a tax system: efficiency, equity, simplicity, the big 3. I see the hissing as being about inefficiency, inequity, high compliance costs. So in Australia, we transfer about $800 billion. Total tax revenue is about $800 billion. So you've got to transfer $800 billion from the private sector to the public sector to get government to run. That's a tricky exercise. There's a lot of money to move. And you're just trying to minimise the inefficiencies, the inequities, the compliance costs in doing that. Minimise your hissing. I'll just mention one other review. It's not it wasn't a major review of the Asprey dimension, but it was the same time Russell Matthews was a ANU academic, and they were very worried about the interaction between inflation and the tax system. I'll just mention this now because I'm going to come back to it. And so the Matthews review recommended that we should index the personal income tax rate scale and parts of the base, so asset values. So things that were being eroded in real terms by inflation, index those. The rate scale, this is to stop bracket creep. And bracket creep really, is if you've got inflation above 10%, that's a lot of bracket creep going on. Okay, this was not implemented by the Whitlam government, who'd commissioned the review, but it was partly implemented by the Fraser government in the late 1970s. They did index on and off for about 5 years. It did not stand the test of political time, because what you're giving up by indexing the tax scale is the ability to announce a tax cut every couple of years. Malcolm Fraser famously went to the 1977 election with the fistful of dollars election campaign. We'll give you a big tax cut, showing the fistful of dollars how much tax cut you're going to get. You can't do that if you've given up the thing that's driving it, which is bracket creep. I'm going to come back to that, so I'm just mentioning it on the way through. Okay, so Asprey's not implemented. Reports in 1975, the final tumultuous year of the Whitlam government. So it just sits there. Now, at this stage, Bill Hayden's Treasurer, he's quite interested in it actually, but he says, look, we're just not in a position to do it. So it goes on. Tax avoidance and evasion really ramps up in the kind of late 70s, early 80s. Got these high tax rates, the big holes in the tax base, big breakdown in taxpayer morality, this thing that you know, we kind of all kind of roughly accept we should, you know, we pay taxes to fund government. Wage and salary earners in particular can see others just brazenly walking around the tax system. So there's a lot of resentment and everyone's, you know, when you see this widespread tax avoidance and evasion, you think, well, why am I the mug that pays my tax when all these other people are not? But you know, it does get actioned a little bit by the Fraser government, not in this sort of policy sense, but we have the bottom of the harbour schemes, the most outrageous of these, and they do legislate against those quite late, quite reluctantly, but they don't take major policy action until we get the Hawke-Keating government. They come in 1983 and they are a reformist government. They're on an agenda to make reforms, big reforms, social and economic. And Keating in particular is pushing major, you know, the floating of the dollar, the deregulation of the financial sector, the bringing down of tariffs, and a big part of that is tax reform. It's right on their agenda, especially on Keating's agenda. So they have a review in 1985, quite a short review. It only went for 5-6 months. It's sort of basically done mainly within Treasury. And they knew what they wanted to do. They didn't need to have a big review to tell us what to do. They already knew what they wanted to do. It was in the Asprey review. They tried to implement Asprey. Capital gains tax, fringe benefits tax, foreign tax credit system, dividend imputation system, big tightening of business expenses, and a GST. The whole thing. Now the GST did not get up at the tax summit in 1985. That's the bit that fell over. All of the rest of it there got up. This is a massive reform. Now it was painted as a bit of a loss for Keating and Treasury because you got rolled on the consumption tax. Well, maybe, but that's a huge reform. You know, to contemplate something like that now is almost unimaginable. Major reform, but of course the consumption tax didn't get up. So then we get the Howard-Costello government. Again, not quite a reformist government, quite in the dimensions of the Hawke-Howard, but still a fairly reformist government. John Howard is definitely, sort of interested in reform. Costello was very interested in reform, economic reform. So they set about finishing the Asprey blueprint by doing the consumption tax part, the bit that Keating couldn't get up. Okay, they go, the slight awkwardness, because John Howard has said never ever for a GST on the back of John Hewson losing the unlosable election over a GST. Anyway, they do it, they have a go, they go to the what are we up to, 90, whatever that is, 83, whatever the second election is, I've lost track of my years now, must have been 1998, was it? They just get back in. They go to it with the GST and then implement that in 2000. Now there's some pretty big base exemptions. Health and education were never in the base. Food came out in the negotiations in the Parliament. But we ended up with a fairly broad-based GST at 10%. And the little tweak here, to get the states on board, the states were not on board in 1985 when Keating tried to do it. They say all the GST revenue will go to the states. That's all the states are now on board. And so they got it up. So that kind of completed the Asprey blueprint. This is by the year 2000. So Asprey's in 1975. It took 25 years to do this, but this is all Asprey. This is all coming out of that Asprey review. So anyway, that was a big lesson for me because I could have compared that to that 1942 income tax unification, which was really implementing what these two earlier royal commissions had recommended, but had not been implemented at the time. So that was, again, it was a 20 to 30 year process. This is another 25-year process. It took. So, okay, I haven't got much more to say. A couple more things. I'll just sort of get into this century. So that was 2000, we got the GST. And the only big review this century was the Ken Henry review, the 2009 AFTS. You've got to have a good acronym for all these reviews. AFTS is okay. It's not as good as rats and ants, the first two, but Okay, so it's kind of, sort of having another go. There's a bit of, the game's changed a little bit. The whole, the mantra in certainly Treasury terms is, broaden the base, lower the rate, broaden the base, lower the rate. That's what tax reform looks like. There's a bit of a qualification now to that with a few things, including sort of optimal tax theory, which says, well, you don't necessarily tax everything at the same rate. You might tax more inelastic things a bit higher, land, inelastic. You might tax more elastic things a bit lower. And where that takes you is around capital income, relatively mobile in a global economy. But the same broad idea. Now, there's 138 recommendations. By the time it reports, it's a difficult time for the government. We're just post-GFC. Kevin Rudd's just come back from Copenhagen, the big climate change conference, and things didn't go well. So they were trying to introduce the resource super profits tax, a very good tax, but it doesn't go well. Kevin Rudd basically loses his job over it. The mining industry run a big campaign against it. But ARF still sits there. There's 138 recommendations as a guide. So about the time I left Treasury, just after I did a count up of how many of the 138 recommendations have been actioned, I got about a third. And that was 7 years ago. It could well be half by now, because when you're sitting in Treasury or somewhere, a new thing comes up, you think, oh, how do we think about this? You go back to, what is the kind of most recent authoritative document? ARFS remains that foundational kind of document. But the reality is we've had little reform of substance this century, little economic reform generally. There's tinkering, and sometimes that's good, sometimes, bad. It goes in different, a lot of colour and movement. And how am I going for time, Emma? You want another 5 minutes? Okay. Okay. I think we got spoilt by the resources boom. It sort of mucked a lot up. We kind of used to sort of have a bit more accepting of an idea that, look, we need big reforms, dynamic reforms, and don't worry about immediate winners and losers. It's good for the, and we're all, good going forward. The resources boom sort of got this thing, everyone had to be a winner, like an immediate winner, and it was possible. We had so much money, it was possible. Ken Henry was bemoaning this. Ken Henry launched the book up in Canberra 2 or 3 weeks ago, and saying he was partly responsible because he was part of building the modelling within Treasury, PrisMod, that enabled this calculation of winners and losers, like immediately, overnight, you won some dollars, you lost some dollars. And that just made it more difficult for governments, in fact. Now, you can't put the genie back in the bottle, I'm afraid, but the way the way you can sort of get everyone to be a winner apparently, bracket creep. I certainly had a saying. I better not attribute this to others, that bracket creep's a government's best friend. This is the thing that's ticking away, giving you more money, and it's not very transparent. Now, is that good or bad? Question mark. Most people would say bad. I'm not so convinced. But what governments do is basically give back bracket creep just to return, give tax cuts just to return bracket creep. So I wanted to have a look in the context of the stage 3 tax cuts debate. So stage 3, remember, there were stages 1 and 2, and there's a lot of focus on stage 3 because, but when this is the, was it, I can't remember if it was Abbott or Turnbull, Morrison's treasurer, they do this, it's a 7-year plan. Initially they tried to do this more quickly, but the negotiation to get it through the parliament was that the high income earners had to wait till stage 3. Stages 1 and 2 focus more on lower and middle income earners. So I want to put the 3 together, so I call it 3 stage, not stage 3. I want to look over that 7-year period that these 3 stages are implemented and ask the question, are we just returning bracket creep? Is that what's going on here? Is there something more than that, less? So what you see here on this chart, okay, it's a little complicated, but so the stepped line, so it's a blue and a red line, the two lines that go in the steps, that's the marginal tax rate. The red one, okay, is the legislated marginal tax rate schedule from 1 July this year, from the year 24-25. That is what's legislated. That is This is the Labor government's legislated steps. Now just remember here that if you go back to the previous coalition government, they'd legislated the previous stage 3 tax cuts. Now Labor's legislated new ones. If you go back to that original one, both sides, coalition and Labor, voted for that original scale. Got this new one here, the new Labor government one, both sides voted for the new scale. I find that just slightly ironic that they both voted for both, but both talk about how outrageous it is, all the big problems. It's funny you voted for it then, but anyway, so that's the blue, that's the red line, sorry, that's the actual legislated tax scale. What I wanted to do is go back and take the 2017 tax scale, okay, year 0 of this 7-year plan, and index that for inflation. I picked inflation as the thing I would index by. It's a bit messy, you've got to index, you just index each of those thresholds, 18,200 tax-free threshold, then it's 45, then it's 120, and then it's 180, I think, something like that. And you've got to index LITO, you've got to index the Medicare levy thresholds, bunch of stuff, but do it all, trace it all through, and what I come up with is the blue line. So you can see, look at the tax-free threshold, the red line is 18,200, the blue line is indexed out to 22,000 or something. And then I calculate the average tax rate. This is what tells you how much tax people pay. Okay, so the red, the curved lines, the lighter red average tax rate is the average tax rate of what has been legislated. That's what people will pay from 1 July this year. The blue line is the indexed average tax rate. So what this is telling you is that compared to what would have happened if we just said, let's get rid of bracket group, let's just index the tax scale. Forget stages 1, 2, 3, just index. The blue line tells you that. The red line is saying low income earners will be paying a bit more than they would have, because the red line's above the blue line down at the left-hand side. That's because the one thing that does not change in any of this is the tax-free threshold, the 18,200. So they must be worse off compared to indexation. Then you go through the middle and you see the blue line is higher. So the red line, the actual legislated line, those middle income earners are paying a bit less. There's not much in it, there's a bit less. And the very high income earners is about the same. So, but overall, it's a pretty close fit. There's a bit of a gap in the middle there, but overall, so pretty much, and certainly in aggregate terms, all we've done is return bracket creep, but a little bit of redistribution of the tax burden away from middle income earners onto low income earners. That's really what's happened here. Anyway, so that, and I think, now let me just finish then on intergenerational equity. Well, I won't pause here, we can talk about it in the discussion, but Ken Henry at the launch was talking about the intergenerational tragedy of what we're doing. If we do have this heavy reliance on personal income tax, and looking forward, we'll have a shrinking proportion of the population of working age, we're going to have a smaller proportion having to fund the rest of us in our retirement. I won't dwell on that. I think the lessons I've kind of covered, the foundational versus determinative review thing. There's a bunch of process things very important, but I'm not going to dwell on that either because I want to get to the discussion. I'll just finally say a little bit on prospects. Quite a bit, if the question is, do we know now what tax reform looks like? And so we just need a determinative review to come along and implement it. I think we know some things and we don't know other things. Unfortunately, it'd be nice if ARFS gives us some answers, the Ken Henry gives some answers, but not all the answers, I don't think. Some things are obvious. The way we tax savings is a complete mess. So you've got housing, you've got superannuation, you've got shares, you've got bank deposits. Every one of those is taxed differently and wildly differently. From bank account where we tax the returns in full to owner-occupied housing where we don't tax the returns at all. Superannuation basically in a similar camp to owner-occupied housing. That's a mess. Transaction taxes are a problem. So this is stamp duties basically at the state level. It's disincentive to transact and inequitable to those that have to transact more. If you have to move more often for your job, buying and selling your house, you'll pay a lot more tax. If you're thinking about downsizing, you'll have to pay this tax. It's a disincentive to people doing what they want to do. And I think it's pretty clear what we need to do in the natural resource and environment space. We need a resource rent tax, a proper resource rent tax, and at the global emissions level, having a carbon tax or an emissions trading scheme is kind of, I think, is obvious, certainly to economists. Some things are less so. What to do about capital income dividend imputation, the company income tax system, is very tricky in a world where capital is internationally mobile. We can't necessarily just sit here anymore and say, we're not going to acknowledge that. And the big issue of it, the weight and the progressivity of the personal income tax system. So I think these things are sort of still a bit up in the air. So I think I've got some other charts, Emma, but I think maybe that's enough, and we can go to the charts if that's where the discussion wants to go. Okay.
And thank you, Paul. Thank you very much. Fascinating talk. Going to be a fascinating book. I haven't read it yet, but I know what I'm doing tonight. Okay, who wants to kick us off with a question? Hang on, there's a microphone coming to you.
Oh, sorry.
Just for our friends at home.
Fame at last. I'm looking at countries like Norway who, for their natural resources, actually grabbed some of the profits from that, and now they have things like free education and things like that. And you look at places like Qatar and their natural gas, they're actually charging their customers far more than Australian companies do. So I'm just wondering why or how this could be actually changed, because there's still that inequality where people like Gina Reinhardt and Forrest and people like that, enormous wealth-making opportunities, and yet it's Australia's natural resources, and I don't quite get it.
Well, I'm happy to add to it. I don't think you look at those places. I think you're talking basically about government ownership of the natural resources. So they kind of say, the government said, well, they're in the ground, they're part of, and we own them. We do it differently. Most countries do it differently, which is that you allow private sector companies to do that mining. Now, okay, that's just a different model. But having gone down the model we have, we should be taxing it more effectively, and so there is a lot of tax coming out of the mining sector, and a lot of it is through royalties at the state level, and a lot of it's through the company tax. But there's a kind of an economic concept of an economic rent. So we'd say, well, all sort of businesses are going to need to earn a normal rate of return. There's an average rate of return, and when they're making decisions about whether to invest or not, they're going to have to earn that average normal rate of return. At least that, they'd like to get a little bit more. There's an idea of these sort of economic rents on top of that. Some industries, over long periods of time, can earn more than a normal rate of return, well more, way more. And the resource sector is classic, maybe the banks. But the resource sector, so the economic argument is that we should tax that economic rent, and we can do that in a way that should have no impact on the decision whether to invest or not, because the hurdle is the normal rate of return. Once you're over that, it's just the cream on the top. So we do that in a very inadequate way in Australia. That's unfortunate, but hopefully a review can fix it. But we did try this. Kevin Rudd lost his job over it, so let's not think this is kind of all that easy.
I noticed there's no reference in any of that to inheritance and wealth tax, although we did have inheritance tax at one occasion. I recall Piketty in his 21st century capitalism argued that, looking at the tax system over centuries, that the wealth and the inheritances was the way that such extraordinary wealth was accumulated.
Yeah.
And yet it's hardly touched. What's your thinking about that?
I'm thinking that I made a mistake in this slide. It should be in some things are obvious. and wealth taxes. See, these things, you look around the OECD, there's a vexed sort of history with them. They're not big revenue raisers anywhere, these wealth and inheritance taxes. Now, wealth taxes, you know, there's it's a bit tricky with wealth taxes because they can distort, but as an equity measure, it seems like an obvious thing. Now, we used to have inheritance tax in Australia. We did right from the start, but we gave them up in the 1970s. This was a Bjelke-Petersen driven thing, competing amongst the states. Come to Queensland to die because you'll avoid your inheritance tax, which is kind of a bizarre idea. But the really bizarre thing in all that, I could see why the other states gave it up because, you know, the interstate competition. But the Commonwealth had an inheritance tax, and we gave it up as well. I mean, this is just mind-bogglingly, you know, stupid. I mean, here was a perfectly good tax. There's no interstate competition thing. All countries do it, but at the time there's this kind of political, something about death. I mean, economists like to tax things that are immobile, that can't, you know, that you don't distort. We don't want to distort behaviour. You know, the idea you're going to delay death to avoid your tax makes no sense. It should be on that slide, and I apologise, it should be there. Yeah, I agree with you completely.
Excellent point. Yeah, over here.
Oh, g'day. I was just on the issue of capital gains discounting.
Yeah.
So I was brought in under Howard to replace indexing, which was far too complex. I mean, you have to go to account to do your tax return even for basic sale of shares. So the idea of having a 50% discount, because like if you earn interest, you pay tax on $1. If you earn rent, you pay tax on $1. If you work, you pay tax on $1. Why would capital gains be half? Just for that. Another one, just very briefly, special building write-off. You have a property that the building cost of the property you can depreciate over 40 years. Properties go up in value, they don't go down in value. Why would you get a deduction from going down in value?
I suspect I don't have a great answer to the second one, so let me start on the first one. So when we introduced capital gains tax in 1985, it was indexed, as you say, cost-based index for inflation. Then we get to the Ralph review in 1999, and they recommended kind of as a simplification measure. There's a lot of pushback, complaining about I can't keep track of the indexation factors and what the so let's simplify it. Instead of indexing, so we would not tax the full capital gain. You'd say it's the full capital gain minus an allowance for inflation. So simplification. Well, let's rough justice. Let's just go with a number. The right number on average was probably something like 40% discount at the time. That was the view. And this is the Howard Costello government said, let's be a bit generous along the way, encourage investment, and we'll go for 50. That's where the 50 came from. So it was deliberately concessional, and it does not do the right job for adjusting for inflation. It's trying to be a proxy on average. Now, the ARFs, the Henry Review, recommended they did not recommend reintroducing indexation. They did recommend going to a 40% discount. Okay, reduce the discount and get it closer to the thing. Depreciation, depends what's I think the building is depreciated at over 40 years. Yeah, the idea is the building is depreciating, but the land value might be increasing. There's separate building versus land. So you should pay capital gains tax on the land if and when you sell it. And so any of these things like depreciation and accruals concept, this idea that we're not going to wait until you sell the building, we'll let you deduct the depreciation over that period of time. So the idea is the building's depreciating, but the land may be appreciating, but for some reason on the deduction side, we seem to think accruals is a natural thing to do. Depreciation is an accrue. Each year you accrue and you get your tax deduction. Now, when we get to the income side, the capital gain, we say, well, we couldn't possibly tax you as the gain accrues. We've got to wait till the end, so we have a realisations basis. But I think the answer goes to the building versus the land. That's my best shot at it. Yeah.
It's just that you pay for the maintenance and repairs.
Well, that's all deductible immediately. Yeah. Yeah.
One more. We've got time for one more.
As you said at the outset, tax is basically part of a social contract between the government and the people. One of the things that a number of economists have been saying, people like Paul Keating, for example, is that in Australia right now, the previous Liberal government put a cap on the federal government's share of GDP. I think it's about 23.9%.
At the Commonwealth level, yeah.
At the Commonwealth level. And that, in fact, one of the key things we need to do is actually increase the GDP share going to the Commonwealth to pay for the sorts of services that are required.
Yep.
And that could be something like 3 to 4% of GDP. How do you see, that issue interacting with these issues about, if you like, the process of plucking birches, how many feathers you take? Because it seems to me that really creates an additional complication. But how do you see that interacting with the issues that you've raised?
Yeah, it's of course it's absolute front and centre of how we think about that. I mean, in a kind of my treasury kind of mentality kind of thing, I'd see myself I'm the tax policy advisor. Someone else would decide on the size of government. My job is to help them get whatever revenue they need. But I certainly recognise the argument that when we look at this tax to GDP thing here, there's a Commonwealth line, the blue line is kind of at 23.9%, the green line's more about 30%. Where is that going? And when we look at the pressures on the spending side, disability, aged care, health generally, defence, there are a bunch of things where you think we're not going to be able to hold this where we are. Realistically, the size of government is probably going to have to increase. Now, this is a huge moment, I think, for a society, because that tax to GDP to me, line of best fit, is flat for 40 years. So for 40 years, we've kind of, this is not just a kind of a Josh Frydenberg kind of line. This is nearly half a century. So if you're going to make a change now, this is a big deal for a society. So, okay, that's the first thing. The second thing, when you get to, my job, currently we've got to raise $800 billion a year. Okay, I've got views about how we do that. So they say you've got to raise 900 billion or $1 trillion or something. What I'd want is to say, well, let's think about that deliberately. Don't just let it happen through bracket creep. Bracket creep will do that in the space of 5 years or something. This is not hard. Let bracket creep run like the Menzies government did. You'll ramp up, no problem. But hopefully we can do better than that. We can say, well, actually, are we happy for the personal income tax share to increase? This is Ken Henry's intergenerational tragedy point. Or are we going to bite the bullet and think about tax reform, which would take us down other paths, land tax, resource rent, maybe a sort of an environmental, road user charges, a bunch of sort of much more efficient and equitable tax bases. But don't let it just happen. Do it deliberately. And we know some of those, what those do it deliberately look like. We don't know some others, obviously. But.
And then we hit the politics of it all. Thank you very much.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Thank you. That was fantastic.
Oh, thank you, Emma. Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you all for your informed questions, as always. As I said at the start, we do have Paul's book for sale here today. I'm sure if you are nice to him, he might even sign a copy for you. So absolutely. Meredith can help you with that. They're $45 each. And I've just started reading it while listening, and yeah, it's good. I'm going to be right into it, so I'll give you my review next time. Next month we will be meeting again. So the 1st of May is a Wednesday, so again we're meeting on the 4th Wednesday technically here. The 22nd, because the federal budget is on Tuesday the 14th. So on Wednesday the 22nd of May we will be joined by Daniel Molino, who's spoken to us before, of course leading Victorian MP in the Albanese government and the chair of the very powerful House Economics Committee, and he'll be here.
He wrote a book about the social contract.
He did.
And welfare.
He did, which I was endorsed on the back cover. It's another terrific book that Daniel spoke to us about last year. So Daniel will be here to unpack the last Albanese budget before the election. Well, there might, I think, be a slightly early one next year if the government goes full term as it intends to. But there's a lot to look out for in that budget, obviously. So we look forward to seeing you then on the 22nd. Thanks again. Bye-bye.